President Cyril Ramaphosa has urged wealthy nations to act on their commitments to invest in infrastructure in Africa. He was addressing over 300 dignitaries at the new Global Financing Pact summit held in France this week. The gathering aims to lay the foundation for a new financial system that is designed to withstand common 21st century concerns, including inequality, climate change and others. The CEO of the Frontline group, Dr. Musyoka, joins us now to talk more about the President's remarks. A very good afternoon or good morning to you. In fact, Doctor, thank you for your time today. So when President Ramaphosa and other African leaders talk about being treated and seen as equals on these global platforms, what should that look like?
So I think I always like to locate these kinds of discussions in historical context, just very briefly, and this is not something new. The call for equality, global equality on a range of issues, from climate change to financial dealings and all of that, that has been going on since at least late 1980s into the 1990s, and the call for reform of the global institutions, IMF, the World Bank, and WTO, the World Trade Organization, that debate has been going on. So what President Ramaphosa is pushing through is really a continuation and concerting still the pressure to see if there are potential reforms that might evolve out of these conversations. And so there's a global South push and a global South conversation that has been going on for the last 20 years. But unfortunately, inequalities have increased. We've seen that during COVID-19, inequality of vaccine distributions and so on. So there's very little that has changed for the last 20 years.
But can African countries really be equals with nations and institutions? They basically are asking for money, for financial help, given how much wealth and money influence or buy power, in fact, in such environments.
So there are two schools of thought, essentially, on global financial debate. And the one is to reform these institutions so that they are more responsive to the global South and they take into account these questions of inequality. The second school of thought is largely currently now led by China, which is to suggest that there is a need to recreate or create new institutions altogether that could then challenge the existing traditional or conventional institutions. And unfortunately for the West, even though there is a call for reform, the train has already left the station because, as we know, BRICS is an emerging southern bloc, very vocal, and that is an alternative to suggest that these reforms that we are calling for are not really going to occur. And so the alternative is to rather create institutions that at their core they are intended at pushing forward the development of the global South. So to answer your question, Tambikile, directly, I think that it is a very, very difficult question to deal with for developing countries to reform these institutions because they are funded by Western powers. They have shares. They are accountable to their political constituents. And that makes it very difficult to create symmetric conversations when one is much more powerful financier of these institutions than the other. And I think that perhaps these push for reforms have led these countries to look at now alternatives, which is why we're talking about BRICS.
How viable, though, is BRICS as an alternative when you consider that on the continent only South Africa is an actual member? Yes, there are murmurs of interest elsewhere, but as things stand, only one African state is actually part of the grouping.
So I think it's consequential because China is there, and China, however way you look at any equation, China is consequential for the next 40, 50 years in any bloc, and that's the first. But also we have seen increasing expansion of BRICS. We know that countries like Saudi Arabia wanting to join, Argentina. I think there is a list of more than 29 countries that have expressed interest to join the BRICS, and I suspect that you're going also to see morphing of more African countries also joining in. So I think it's not perfected institution, but I think it's peaked momentum. That much is clear, and it is clearly a threat to the existing traditional institutions, particularly because China and India are present. And I mean, if you look at whether it's demographics or economic, global economic supplies, China and India are significant players, and I think that is worrying the West quite much.
A key thing that came out of the gathering in France this week is this, that the likes of the World Bank, for example, will now have to source about $200 billion US. This would be for low-income economies, basically by taking on more risk. Does that sort of funding still work for the benefit of African states, or do we then have to pay it back in kind, perhaps?
No, it doesn't, Tembekile, because there are 2 points to make on that. The first is that it's not a new commitment. If you look at the climate change commitment of $100 billion, that's not really been actualized. And so there are questions as to whether these are just commitments or aspirations. The second more consequential point to make is that when you look at the global development arena, we've seen a shift from nation states governing to multinational corporations governing, and they are very powerful as far as the influence on the World Bank and the IMF are concerned. So ultimately, they get to make decisions, and that undermines any effort that even their own nation states, these Western powers, would like to push forward. So that complicates the picture significantly. So I do not think that this is likely to go forward. It's part of reforms, and it's certainly better than nothing. But it's not. We're not going to see, in my assessment, any consequential or meaningful change from what we've seen in terms of global inequalities.
So African countries are calling for reforms within the World Bank structures, for example, the International Monetary Fund, because the continent remains largely underdeveloped, and there is a need for this money, right? And that is why the African countries continue to participate in these Western-led financial forums, etc. Why is the West still so interested, so keen to keep Africa within that fold? What is in it for them?
If you have, firstly, there's a lot of literature that is written about how developed countries really rely on developing countries, whether it's for cheap labor or raw materials. And a lot from the 1950s, development economics makes that point very clear. So these countries, the way their economies are set up, they cannot survive without China, without Africa, and as a matter of fact, Africa, which is now the youngest continent, it is going to be the source of labor force for countries that are more aging. So they cannot survive without Africa, except that it is a dependency syndrome that you would like to perhaps, it might not be intentional to keep African countries or developing countries for dependency purposes, but it does serve their interests, certainly, to keep these countries somehow happy, even if it's through tokenism and not real development happening.
Is it more of a fear, though, of the influence of Russia and China, I wonder, that if the West leaves a vacuum, then indeed the two will expand their grip on Africa?
Partly. Before the rise of China, there was, of course, still colonization, as you know, and that has a lot to do with economics without really getting into the politics. But as you rightly point out, the rise of China and the influence of China in the global south is worrying a lot to the West. But as I've always argued on these platforms, unfortunately, it's a little bit too late for these Western powers. China has already occupied territories and more grounds than it was imagined. And I think that these countries are waking up now to the realities of a much more powerful country in the global south, which is likely to become the next superpower. That is concerning from a geopolitical point of view, because the question might be, what does it mean for global security? What does it mean for democracy? Those are questions that are forcing these countries to try and also reach out to other African countries or developing countries to try and match up China.
Dr. Jason Musyoka, good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time.